interesting. And because often we speak about the economy and social impacts, but well-being is a really important thing to consider as well, and often are directly linked to the other two and things you were talking about. And it makes complete sense on all the results, because there's so much uncertainty for everyone, it seems. So not being able to plan or know what's going to happen is quite scary for a lot of people of all ages. And it's interesting to see, though, how different countries are differently impacted and how they kind of deal with respond to the problems in their economy. So I think it's really worthwhile to study this, like you are doing at Eurofound, to learn why and what we can do about it, I suppose. So you actually, my second question,
that's an interesting thing, Sophie, just to come back on that, is that the whole idea of the European Union in some way being a sort of a convergence machine that allows us to ensure that we close the gaps between countries, you know, that there's an upward convergence of living standards and economic standards across the European Union. And that certainly will have taken its toll over a recent period due to the impact of the virus.
Yes, completely, because there's so much difference and diversity in the European Union. So it's not like one medicine fixes everything. But also one thing I want to just, what you were talking about, you know, teleworking and different ways of working, you know, the whole digital transformation of the labor market and everything, it like you said, it was already happening, but on a much slower pace. So now I think we're all kind of a bit shocked. Like, for example, my university lectures are going to all be online now, which is very different, you know. So all of a sudden we depend on technology more than we could have ever imagined, which also maybe you feel lonely when you're at home, like you mentioned. And lots of things are connected to this, pros and cons. So yeah, so the second question, you've had really lots of interesting things to say about it. It was about the well-being of people in Europe. But I'm just interested to figure out why certain countries' well-being is so much lower or so much more affected than other countries. Is it the governments, how they respond, or just the citizens' culture, or have you discovered any reasons for the disparity and differences?
Well, that would be part of the more in-depth analysis that we will carry out now following the second phase of the survey, which has taken place, if you like, 2 months in. And we will have the results of that at the end of August. And then what we're looking at is having an overview report, which we will produce in September, which will in fact look at that sort of thing, trying to map to some degree, I mean, as much as is, you know, humanly possible, is there a link between how governments responded, the tone that was set in terms of the policies that were introduced in those countries. And we have what we call a database, which is our EU Policy Watch database, which was really to look at the kind of policies that were introduced by different governments to offset the worst of the effects of the crisis. And there we would try to see, for example, we do know that there are high levels of depression in countries like Bulgaria, Greece, Poland, and France. They were the highest levels of depression. So is there some correlation there with the kind of policies or lack of policies or that were introduced? Clearly, you know, we can't delve into that in the kind of detail that perhaps we will do at a later stage, at a much later stage. But looking at the second phase of the survey, perhaps we'll see that there's been, you know, a dilution of the immediate impact in France, and perhaps we'll see there's been a rise in levels of satisfaction in that country, but perhaps there's been a further decline in others. So I think we have to kind of keep an eye on the trajectory here and have a sort of almost a time series approach to seeing how things evolve over this period. Certainly some countries have been particularly striking, and I think what has been most striking about a country like France is that whereas in previous times we've seen Bulgaria and Greece and Romania, those countries have tended to to sit in a particular position when we look at life satisfaction indicators. France wouldn't. France would have been more oriented towards the top level of that scale, and to see it therefore at the bottom rungs of that particular ladder would be something that would be of concern. What that's about, you know, again, we look at comparative figures within Eurofound. We're not looking necessarily at the internal national workings of a country. That's not what we're doing. So therefore, it would be remiss of us to try and explain, you know, the national kind of context. But what we can show is that there is clearly some degree of uncertainty or a problem of some description when we see a country that would have featured in the top level moving to the bottom level across different indicators of well-being. So that's what we're trying to show. And when you see that there's low levels of resilience, then you have to say, okay, well, there clearly from a European perspective, perhaps policymakers need to look at what are the factors and the elements that could improve resilience. You know, how can we boost social capital? How can we make people increase their levels of satisfaction? What is required in those countries to do that, so that we can kind of begin to address the discrepancies and indeed close the satisfaction gap, if you like, that we're looking at. Because clearly levels of feeling of exclusion or feelings of low levels of satisfaction or low levels of optimism about the future, that impacts directly on your ability to engage in your society, and so therefore that increases you know, societal tensions, and therefore you have sort of a disengagement, which clearly has, you know, knock-on ripple effects for societal and economic growth. So, you know, these are all interrelated issues, which is why it's so important to have an evidence base from which then you can make policy decisions that actually hit the right spot in the right areas, so that we can improve the general living and working conditions.
Interesting. And just, I don't know if this is fact-based, but just in general, it seems countries like Ireland, for instance, or southern countries, Italy, are very social countries. So, you know, not being able to meet up and interact with your neighbour stuff seems to be affect them perhaps in a different way. Whereas, you know, stereotypically in Scandinavian countries, they're more distanced and stuff. So perhaps they don't mind as much. I have a friend from Latvia, and she was making a joke that her family were saying when the 2-meter social distancing was, you know, not in place anymore, that they were like, oh yes, we can go back to 5 meters social distance. So yeah,
I have a Scandinavian friend who said something similar. He said that they didn't actually have to introduce physical distancing there already.
Yeah, there's no need to have any rules. But yeah, so perhaps the fact that the pubs in Ireland are still closed and it keeps getting delayed might impact people in a different way, because, you know, it's really important for them to be able to socialize with all their friends. But again, that's stereotypical and probably it's to be looked into. But yeah, it's
no, certainly, and there are different cultural dimensions which clearly have you know, specific national specific impact, you know, which we can't underestimate. But then, as you said earlier, you know, there isn't one size fits all when you're dealing with that, which is why from a national perspective, it's so important that the national policymakers also take on board the findings that are seen, which can be of relevance to them specifically, so that they can take action which is relevant to their communities.
Yes, individually, yeah. Great.